Well, so this is the challenge, right? So when I get asked the question, what percent of Agile transformations fail? It reminds me a lot of back in the early days of Agile, where, and these were like very common conversations up on like PMI message boards and things like that, where the conversation was like, is my organization right for Agile? And and the reality is that almost all organizations can benefit from Agile, but almost no organizations in their default configuration are really ready to adopt Agile. Okay, so if you answer the question, is my organization ready for Agile, or is my organization able to do Agile? The answer is almost inevitably no, because Agile, and what was required to make Agile work is that you have to have teams that are organized around value. Those teams have to be operating off of a really clean backlog. They have to be able to produce a working tested increment of product at the end of every sprint. Those are like the preconditions to do Agile right. And almost all companies that are not doing Agile, or doing Agile not very well, they don't have those preconditions in play, right? So the challenge is, it's not asking yourself, is my organization right for Agile? The question is how do I get my organization into the place where it can benefit from Agile methodologies, right? That's the core understanding. And then where you go from there is you say, well, what percent of Agile transformations fail? Well, I would recommend, or I would say that almost all Agile transformations that I've been exposed to, that we weren't involved in, have not started from that basic understanding, right? So you take an organization that's in functional silos and you say, okay, we're going to transform it to Agile, but you don't address the functional siloing. You don't address the way governance is handled. You don't address the way metrics are handled. You don't reorganize around value that is important to your customers and markets. If you don't reorganize and rethink the organization, it's going to fail. So that's what I'm suggesting. So like in practice, and this is the interesting challenge. It's like you don't have really clean data on what success looks like in the market. So if success is, I have installed Scrum or I've installed Safe, well then a lot of them are successful. If it's, am I getting the business benefit out of it? Like, do I have the ability to deliver with predictability? Do I have the ability to put things in market fast? Do I have the ability to inspect and adapt and pivot as a result of installing the Agile methodologies? The answer is, unfortunately, there's not very many of them. So the question that you have to ask yourself isn't how many Agile transformations fail, because the answer to that question is a lot of them. The question you have to ask yourself is, what do I need to do to make my Agile transformation not fail? And what Leading Agile's been doing for the last 12 years is we really kind of got started focusing on what does an Agile system of delivery look like? What are the principles behind it? And so in talks, you guys hear me talk about teams, backlogs, working tested software, structure, governance, and metrics. The idea of manage dependencies until you break them. Like, those are the principles underneath the system of delivery. We invented a very structured and disciplined way of orchestrating a transformation. And it's not just train people, and it's not teach people leadership and behavior and all those things. It's like, how do you approach looking at the business architecture? How do you approach looking at the product model hierarchy? How do you make decisions about what to organize around? How do you orchestrate dependencies until you can break them? What do the intermediate states look like from when you start to when you get to where you want to go? Those are the things, right? So you have to have a credible target for a system of delivery, and you have to have a credible target for how you're going to get the organization from where it is now to where you want it to be in the future. You have to be able to manage stakeholders. You have to be able to create shared understanding across the organization. You have to create the constructs for the change to stick. And so how many organizations fail in their Agile transformations? I would suggest a lot of them. More often than not, what we're doing is coming in and cleaning up behind failed organizations. How many Leading Agile transformations fail? Not many. There's some that don't go so far. There's some that decide to do some things and regress over time. But if you are focused on the patterns and principles of success, and you have a really clear, measurable transformation strategy, you have a way of engaging stakeholders, you have a way of sustaining the changes, and you're willing to do all those things, then it won't fail. I mean, it's impossible for it to fail because Agile is fundamentally true. Creating the conditions for it to work is what most people don't do. So I get asked a lot, like, can Agile and Waterfall coexist in an ecosystem in a company? So if you're familiar with any of Leading Agile's work, we introduced this idea of the 4 quadrants a while ago. And so you have this idea of organizations that are built for predictability and that are built for adaptability. You have the idea of markets that are emergent, like we're trying to figure out what it is we want to build, versus markets that are convergent, that kind of at least kind of know what they want to do, and we're just really kind of managing out risk and uncertainty. So we built this little model where you start in the upper left with predictive emergent, companies that are built for predictability, but things are changing all the time. That tends to be really, really chaotic. You have this lower left quadrant where the organization is built for predictability, has a pretty good idea what it wants. That's typically where Waterfall lives, right? That's the mental model behind Waterfall. I would probably add at this point that I'm not a big fan of Waterfall in any organization, because at the end of the day, what you basically have to do is you have to figure out how to inspect and adapt. So the lower left quadrant, we tend to do Agile, but it's really geared towards for predictability and meeting commitments and things like that. The lower left quadrant is adaptive convergent. And the thing with the adaptive convergent quadrant, that's like typically where Agile's home base is. We're working on meeting commitments, but we're increasing agility by creating the conditions where, like, you can deploy into market fast and you can inspect and adapt and change requirements as you learn new things. The upper right quadrant in our model is the adaptive emergent quadrant, and that tends to be more lean startup. And so going back to the question, you say, well, can Agile and Waterfall coexist? Where you get that question quite often, I grew up in the financial services industry, and so a lot of times we would be building software or changing software that was built on top of or in a 50-year-old legacy mainframe. And now we're dealing with, like, the web, and we're dealing with mobile apps. And so you ask yourself, can a mobile app development, which can be incredibly emergent, incredibly adaptive, can that exist with a legacy mainframe system that's being produced in a waterfall fashion? So the answer is yes, but it's with compromise on both sides. And so what you want to try to do is you want to try to get the waterfall people putting together plans and waterfall projects that can be delivered in smaller chunks. Right, so I'd like my increments, and now it starts to sound a little agile, right? I'd like my increments of a waterfall project to be shorter. What we also have to understand is if we're doing something that is really emergent, then the emergent part's going to have to inspect and adapt within the constraints of the waterfall thing that's being built. And so what we usually try to help people do is to take the waterfall parts and use a really structured, disciplined, agile approach. Really solid teams, really clear backlogs, the ability to produce a working tested increment of software at the end of every sprint, really highly managed dependencies across those value creation teams. You can think of, like, at the portfolio level, we're planning at a high level, 18 months out. Maybe at the program or product level, we're thinking 3 to 6 months out, like a release plan kind of time frame. And then at the lowest level, you're dealing with 2-week sprints, maybe 6-week planning horizons, things like that. So what you really try to do is you try to take the stuff that's waterfall and you'd put a really structured and disciplined way of inspecting and adapting against the known backlog into that system. And so in PMI language, you have this idea of rolling wave planning and progressive elaboration. And so for the waterfall stuff, I put structured, disciplined, agile in, but I would be willing to compromise on a longer term roadmap, kind of a middle term, 3 to 6 month kind of project planning level, and then incremental and iteratively deliver as we go. If you can get your waterfall teams kind of turned into that model, then what you can start to do is you actually have a lot more flexibility on the things that have to be truly emergent. But whenever you have something that is truly emergent with something that is truly convergent, there's going to be compromises on both sides. Where it's difficult, and this is where I think maybe some of the next evolution of Agile comes in, is when you have like waterfall hardware development coupled with software that has to be fairly agile and fairly emergent. And that's probably beyond the scope of what I'm going to go into here. But part of the challenge to do that, it's possible. There's companies that are out there doing it, but you have to really, really rethink your manufacturing processes and how you're bringing products to market on that side. You have to go for greater modularization. You have to go for greater kind of digital presence in the hardware. You have to strive for agility. One of our clients talks about open, agile, and digital as a way of thinking about how we're going to do hardware with Agile. So if it's waterfall hardware in its current state with software, they can coexist, but it's difficult. You're dealing with mocking and stubbing and different abstraction and ways of being able to deliver incrementally and iteratively while the hardware is going at the pace that it goes. Really fundamentally the same problem with legacy monoliths and things like that. It's like you want to deliver iteratively and incrementally to the best of your ability, regardless of how waterfall it is today, and then you're gonna have to make trade-offs on both sides. So there's not a lot of easy answers. The short answer is yes, they can. But the waterfall people need to make some compromises. The agile people need to make some compromises. And roughly that ends up looking like, can we agree on some sync points at a regular interval where the emerging hardware or legacy software has to like sync up with the emerging, mobile app or web app or something like that. So it's not a clean answer. It is possible. We do it all the time, but it's not an out-of-the-box solution. In order to understand why Agile fails, you first have to look at what does Agile look like when it's done right. And that always comes back to the team's backlogs, working tested software conversation. So Agile at the team level, at the work surface level, you have to have a complete cross-functional team. That team has to have everyone and everybody necessary to be able to deliver the work that's in the backlog. You have to have a backlog that's written to a certain set of constraints, right? The invest model, independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. I go back to some of the early Ron Jeffries stuff, a card, a conversation, a confirmation, right? The idea is that you write the requirements in a way that they can be processed by the team in a conversation with the product owner so that we maximize value delivery at the end of every sprint. That's the fundamentals of Agile. Scrum is like an operating system on top of that base hardware. And Scrum gives us a way of saying, okay, we're going to have a role that's a Scrum Master, we're going to have a role that's a product owner, we're going to have a role that's a team, and we're going to do burn down charts, and we're going to do story points, we're going to do daily stand-up meetings, we're going to do reviews and retrospectives. All of that is an operating model on top of the team's backlogs, working tested software construct. And then once you have the operating model in place and you have the process on top of that, then you start to teach the organization how to operate with agility, right? To learn how to really decompose work in a way that maximizes value, that contributes to getting feedback early and often from the customer. The ability to put things in front of a customer on regular intervals and get feedback through that process. Once that happens and people see it's working, then like the behaviors and the attitudes and the mindsets start to shift and they say, this is really possible. Okay? That's the way it's supposed to work. So you ask yourself, well, why does it fail? Well, it fails because we don't do those things, right? We don't create those conditions. The number one failure mode is teaching people Scrum or teaching people safe, and they bring those practices back on top of a faulty ecosystem. So in one of the earlier talks I was doing today, it was like we take the Agile processes and we put them on top of a waterfall organization that's functionally siloed and has legacy governance and legacy financial controls. That will almost never work because those processes are designed to operate on top of an operating model that is teams aligned around value centric. So if you put the processes and the practices on top of an incongruent ecosystem, it's going to fail. if you basically just go and tell leaders that you need to empower your people and you need to trust people and you need to, and then you just let them go to do whatever they're going to do, but you haven't fixed the practices or you haven't fixed the operating model, the structures, then it's going to fail. And so asking why Agile transformation fails, you first have to go like, well, what is required to make it work? And then how do I create the conditions in the organization that actually manifest it in reality? And so it's a tough question to ask because people want an easy button. And a big part of the problem is that the practitioner level folks are going to Agile class, right? They're going to Scrum training, they're going to SAFe training, and they're learning practices, and they get like a nod to the organizational design stuff that has to happen. But the reality is they come back and they're being told to do Agile and they learn the Agile practices, but the leaders in the organization don't fully appreciate the changes that they have to make, right? And so, because the leaders aren't getting educated in this way. So often when somebody calls us, it's somebody mid-level, maybe even fairly senior, and they're like, hey, we've been trying to do Agile for a long time and it's just not working. And I start testing, like, how are you guys forming teams? How are you guys building backlogs? How are you producing working tested software? How are you orchestrating dependencies across teams? How are you changing how you govern the inflow of work? How are you changing what you measure? And they're like, well, we're just doing Agile. Like, that's the problem. That's the failure mode. So you have to understand clearly what does it take to make it work. And then you have to look at your organization and see the gaps. And so everything that we talk about around transformation isn't about installing Scrum, and it's not about changing mindsets. It's about forming teams, building backlogs, producing working tested software. It's about structures at scale. It's about governance. It's about metrics. It's about aligning to value across the entire organization. And in the presence of dependencies, when there's dependencies, you have to manage them. Agile is sort of notorious about just saying dependencies need to go away. We need to break dependencies, or maybe we just ignore dependencies. We can't do it. And so there's this disconnect between the practitioners who don't have the ability to make the necessary changes and the leaders who do have the ability to make the necessary changes aren't either fully committed or they're just not aware. And so that's just not an easy thing to answer in the short run, but in the big scheme of things, there's a way to make it work. You just it takes a minute to educate people sufficiently on how it actually works and why.